Over 39 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. We start again with the situation south of the Ukrainian city of Kostiantynivka. The Russian army continues to advance there. This time, we don't have Russian flag footage, but Ukrainian combat footage that shows us the Russians have managed to now push further forward, likely capturing another 4 villages. We'll take a look at all of this on the map shortly, but let's first let these images play out. We now see, as so often, drone attacks on the Russian occupiers who are slowly advancing. Here we witness the attacks on the village of Romanivka carried out by the North Legion, a specialized drone unit of the 44th Separate Brigade. And the interesting thing is this brigade was operating in Kharkiv just a few days ago. That means about 300 kilometers further north. Now it's operating in the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka region. And that means, and it also shows us how dangerous the situation is here, the Ukrainians have just essentially ordered a redeployment here, taking units from other fronts. They've pulled units from other fronts to Konstantinovka to halt the Russians here. And that's quite interesting because over the past few days, we've repeatedly seen that, well, here, almost every other day, you really have to say a village has fallen in this area. This means the situation here is becoming more difficult and increasingly critical, not just for Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad on one side, but also for Kostiantynivka, which is currently still entirely under Ukrainian control, but also Toretsk on the other side. In Toretsk, as we know, about 95% of the city is under Russian control, but here too, the supply lines would be cut off. If this entire region here eventually falls under the control of the Russian armed forces, we'll let this run for a bit longer, so we can see that it's quite often the case that the Russians pay a heavy price for every meter, that they're losing men as they advance further. Still, they're steadily pushing forward, and we can now observe that on the map. Here we can observe that these include quite substantial urban areas as well. Here, the entire roof is already missing, but this is a 3-story house right in the center of Soria, which, as we can see from these images, is now under Russian control. Let's take a look at the whole thing on the map, and I'll pause briefly beforehand so we can get a better understanding of the situation and the surrounding area. So here, first of all, from a distance, you can see the whole area, Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad on this side, Toretsk largely captured by the Russians, as I mentioned, on the other side, and here, Kostiantynivka. And Kostiantynivka is really a key supply hub for the Ukrainian army. Up until last year, it was also a major fallback point where troops could retreat from the battles in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and so on, where the Ukrainians had extensive logistics where they could also essentially regroup and replenish their troops for the next battle. I was there myself, and it was actually a very quiet place until last year, where you could say we were relatively far behind the front here. You could still live there, and tens of thousands of people were still living there at that time. Now, however, we have the situation where we're facing this massive Russian offensive from the south. This time, I'll mark it in green to make the distinction more visible. This entire area that we have here, pretty much the whole region, was conquered over the last 3 months or so. This is a truly vast area, even larger than Kostiantynivka city limits. The Russians are advancing swiftly toward the city. They were approximately 40 kilometers distant. At this point, they're only 20 kilometers away, and we'll continue to let this unfold to closely examine what we just observed in the drone footage. As mentioned, we've had numerous videos in recent days, like the Russians raising flags in Novopoltavka, for instance, or Novo-Olenivka, but what we've just witnessed here were Ukrainian footage, on one hand from Romanivka, and on the other from Soria. And they clearly demonstrate that considerable progress has been achieved here as well. We now have the town of Pravdivka, which on this map here is still not under Russian control. That, however, is primarily because we don't have any footage, so we have no video material from this region, and in that sense, our map providers at Deep State Map here assume that the Ukrainian claim, namely that they still currently control this village, remains valid. We can actually see how incredibly dangerous the whole situation is, because the orange and the gray in this case represent the Ukrainian-held or contested areas. And if we take a look at this, almost nothing remains up here, which means we have a major problem. There's a risk of encirclement here. So I personally assume that the Ukrainian units have already withdrawn from Pravdivka or are withdrawing in these hours because the Russians have advanced just as quickly to the north. Let's take another quick look further up here and see this N32, which leads here to Kostiantynivka. Here we see Kostiantynivka. Essentially, this is the southern edge of the city. And we can see the Russians are so close that by now, from various directions, from the south, from the east, they can launch these kamikaze drones at it. That makes logistics extremely tough for Ukraine, even though there's no fighting near the city itself. And we can see up here, as I just mentioned, Novolenivka, and we have new footage from Novolenivka showing that the Russians are not only losing men, as we've just seen, but also additional infantry fighting vehicles. And here we see one of these losses captured in this instance from two different angles. The Ukrainians officially state it was a Stugna-P strike, but our detailed analysis suggests this BMP-1 infantry vehicle detonated a mine. We'll let the entire sequence play out, so we'll first observe it from one angle and then from the other. And it's a catastrophic explosion, which likely results in the death of all occupants during this attack. So here we see the explosion from one perspective and then immediately from another, and perhaps you can see it at the very last moment, so to speak. Before the explosion occurs, the front part tilts slightly downward, so the tracks are essentially moving toward the ground. And now we're in the situation where we're witnessing this massive explosion, leading to a complete and total loss for the Russian invading forces. So yes, the Russians continue to lose significant numbers of men and equipment as they push forward toward the front lines near Kostiantynivka. But we also see that the Ukrainians are in a very poor position. Over the past few weeks, something seems to have occurred that triggered this breakthrough at the front. And now they have to bring in new reinforcements, including from Kharkiv to the Donetsk area, in order to at least slow down the Russians here. Discussing Kharkiv means examining the preparations for Russia's new large-scale offensive. We've reported in recent days that Russia has, in a sense, verbally escalated, explicitly warning that if the Ukrainians don't surrender, Putin will take decisive action. He himself referred to it as a buffer zone, a significant invasion area in Kharkiv. At the same time, recent Western media reports have also indicated who say that 50,000 men are here beyond the border, on the other side waiting and gathering beyond the Ukrainian-Russian border, ready to launch a major offensive on Kharkiv and Sumy. And we have new footage from Vovchansk, including something that shows us how this large-scale offensive is likely being prepared. We're seeing truly massive multiple rocket launcher attacks here, both at night and immediately during the day, by the Russian army on the southern part of Vovchansk. We remember Vovchansk, a city that has been under constant attack since the previous year. I think it was in May last year when it partly fell under Russian control during that time. However, the southern half, south of the Vovcha River, remained under Ukrainian control, and here we see it once more through the thermal view. Here we can observe how, one after the other, likely grad rocket after grad rocket strikes the southern section of the city, causing significant destruction. And there is massive destruction. We can see that this is all urban area. These are all areas that were once inhabited but are now completely abandoned and left empty. In any case, this is Vovchansk. And here the Russians are continuing their attempts to attack in order to push the Ukrainers back from the southern part of the city, because for now the Vovcha still serves as the boundary, the front line, the small river that separates the two sides. We also have new footage from the same region, approximately 20 kilometers east of Vovchansk, which clearly shows us that Vovchansk itself is also being attacked by the Russian army, and that's essentially it. That doesn't look particularly impressive right now. This is the Vovcha River flowing along this path, and we can see this small bridge crossing over it. The Russians haven't managed to cross this small river yet, as the Ukrainians are holding one side very strongly and maintaining their defense. Two key elements are crucial here right now: the surroundings, the already shelled bridge, we see it, and the Vovcha. We've got a Ukrainian soldier who is moving slowly here right now. It's unfortunately fatal for him, as the video shows, because he will likely die in this Russian attack now. What the Russians are now attempting is to deploy a Ch-38 missile, which is an aircraft-launched rocket equipped with an incredibly massive warhead weighing 250 kilograms. The Russians choose quantity over quality. They can't hit precisely, even with this modern missile, made since 2012. And that's why they rely on this massive explosion. So we're about to see the missiles approach all of this part of a Russian propaganda video. The surveillance here is already functioning quite well. Video and drone monitoring, here's the evidence. The soldier, whom we'll naturally need to pixelate from now on. This Ch-38, located up here on the left. Do you see that white line? It's clearly visible on it. And now we can also immediately see the impact. We see the impact. We can briefly rewind to catch the moment and see that in fact the Russians missed the bridge. They do not hit it precisely. Approximately 5 meters to the right of the bridge, this Ch-38 strikes the water with full force. That's also the reason why the Russians decided to cut the video right there. They're now waiting for the smoke to clear, but they'll soon see that the smoke has dissipated and the bridge is still intact, which is essentially why they cut it off beforehand and don't reveal to us the actual result of this attack. Nonetheless, we see the Russians practically shelling Kharkiv into submission, gearing up for the significant assault they've been planning, and now we'll take another look at the map to understand the situation better. That means we're once again examining the situation. Kharkiv situated in the northeast of Ukraine. We have these blue areas which were all once under Russian control that were retaken in November 2022. But then again, the Russians are saying, yes, we want to establish a buffer zone here. A buffer zone simply means that we aim to take over thousands more square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Exactly, it encompasses everything situated between Putin's empire here in the east and the free Ukrainian territories over here in the west. And we know, by the way, this is also Kharkiv. We see it here. We've clearly marked the border once more for better reference. The Russians are already advancing there along the Oskil River. They've captured Zaporizhia, they want to take Kupiansk, and they are trying to push further. But the attacks we just observed were targeted on one hand at the southern part of Vovchansk and on the other hand at a region approximately 20 kilometers to the east of Vovchansk. That means the Russians are preparing all of this here with massive attacks, and we can assume that when these operations unfold for the buffer zone they're serious about, then we can take a closer look at these two pockets. Once here near Lipsy, north of Kharkiv, and then the one near Vovchansk, and you see, well, what they need are probably buffer zones about 10 kilometers deep, which they at least claim for themselves, to restrict Ukrainian opportunities to launch potential attacks from those areas directly toward Belgorod or Kursk, or even further north in the direction of Bryansk. So, what the Russians likely have in mind, in a sense, is a zone extending along here, to establish a corridor that connects all these pockets and essentially provides them with the assurance that the Ukrainians won't be able to cross the border anymore. But this is all relative, of course, as the Russians have frequently claimed to protect the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and other territories like that. It was claimed that a buffer zone was needed, that a disengagement of forces was necessary, and in the end, they ended up taking the entire oblasts when they had the opportunity, and it's clear Putin won't simply agree to keep just 20% of Kharkiv. We've already seen how things unfold in such scenarios. 2022 in September then. He annexes everything, even if he doesn't even have full control over those territories yet. The major offensive on Kharkiv remains future music. What is not future music is the offensive of the Russian army in Donetsk. And it's advancing so quickly, among other reasons, because the Russians are now deploying more than 1,000 fiber-guided drones per day against the Ukrainian defenders. And we have new footage that clearly demonstrates just how incredibly efficient these drones truly are. These recordings also show us a great deal. They demonstrate in the analysis that the fiber optic guided drones can operate very close to the ground, that they can operate within a forest. The cable that's trailing this fiber optic drone is very thin, but a range up to 20, even 30 kilometers long doesn't seem to be an issue. Now we also see how the drone is proceeding, that it is attacking a shelter belonging to the Ukrainian army. Here this net has been stretched out, and underneath there's enough space to accommodate a Ukrainian tank, armored vehicle, or even an artillery piece. What's actually underneath is just a completely ordinary civilian off-road vehicle. That means these recordings actually reveal a great deal about the state of the front. Not just about the weapon system deployed here, but also that the Ukrainians virtually prepared the trench, prepared the positions for a large armored vehicle, but in the end only placed a civilian vehicle underneath. However, due to the fiber optic capability of the Russians, we see that this poses no problem for them at all. They go right under the net and are now targeting this vehicle. That was a stationary target. Here we see additional non-stationary ones, which clearly demonstrate this point once more. Ukraine is increasingly relying on civilian vehicles as they have very few armored ones left at the front. Interestingly, we can see here that the houses on the left and right are hardly damaged at all. This means we are in an area where Ukraine might not necessarily expect these attacks, where they would say, well, up until now, there have been relatively few attacks with multiple rocket launchers or artillery in this area. So they think or assume that one can move around here relatively unscathed, which we will also see at the target shortly. We absolutely need to pixelate it because it is extremely brutal. We have a vehicle, likely with 2 people in the front and 3 individuals sitting on the cargo bed. All Ukrainian army soldiers. 2 of them leap off at the very last moment. The third one gets hit by this fiberglass drone. As I mentioned, we're pixelating it. Nevertheless, these are truly horrific images that show us how the Russians are now capable of striking moving targets far beyond the front lines, in various locations where the Ukrainians would least expect it. Lastly, we see another Russian attack, this time targeting an already abandoned Ukrainian armored vehicle. And this is quite interesting. We can see that. The drone initially flies in here and doesn't detonate immediately. As I mentioned earlier, it's quite interesting. Here's the approach. We can see the drone manages to fly directly into the door, and now it's just lying here for a moment, but the Russians notice what's going on here. Namely, so far we haven't seen an explosion. That means we still have a signal. And interestingly, they can still control them. They are clearly capable of doing so. Now, immediately leading to another movement so that the impact sensor here gets triggered, ultimately resulting in an explosion after all. We can't say it with absolute certainty. However, we do know that essentially. This screenshot here with no image always occurs when contact is lost, of course. However, it frequently occurs with a surveillance drone precisely at the moment when an explosion takes place. We don't know for sure in this case, but we do know that the Russians essentially initiated the attack, conducting the flight. The small drone then lay there, didn't explode. The Russians managed, despite the impact, to steer it again using the fiber optic cables, to then carry out this specific movement, effectively triggering the impact sensor, if you will, and causing the drone to explode. Finally, we'll watch 2 Ukrainian videos that demonstrate just how incredibly far these small kamikaze drones can now fly. We're not referring to the fiber optic guided ones here, but rather the traditional radio guided drones that have been in use for roughly 2 years now. So, radio guided ones, and as I mentioned, we've got 2 videos that clearly show how far these drones can now strike deep into enemy territory. The initial video is provided by Ukrainian intelligence. In it, we can see a train transporting fuel, and this fuel-carrying train is actively moving. Yes, seemingly safe in occupied Zaporizhia, about 40 kilometers behind the front. We'll take a look at that on the map in a moment, and the Russians had absolutely no idea that this train, as we can see, all these fuel tanks here, could be attacked by kamikaze drones, small quadcopter kamikaze drones of the Ukrainian army. But that's exactly what happens. We see the approach, and now comes the first direct hit. And now we see the train, it's on fire, has come to a halt. These surrounding houses clearly show where this is happening. And we see that another Ukrainian drone is now approaching and targets another carriage, setting it ablaze here. This is highly significant for the Russians and equally fascinating for us to see, as the Crimean Bridge is no longer absolutely essential. A year ago, it was still being argued that the Crimean Bridge was a key strategic target, essential to the region to be supplied. Meanwhile, so much has been captured in the south of the country, and the rail infrastructure has been so significantly restored that one can now travel via Mariupol and further to Melitopol, for example, with these trains, and from there, the Crimea can also be supplied. The Kerch Bridge has lost much of its strategic significance, as the Russians have captured a large portion of the southern region. We'll now take a look at the whole situation on the map and see once again how deeply Ukraine can strike here. First, what I just mentioned earlier, so simply the fact that the Russians have essentially managed to successfully restore this rail connection right here once again. Or also, yes, these were old Ukrainian connections that they were essentially able to rebuild now. There was very little destruction in Zaporizhia and the southern part of the oblast after the capture. That means it follows roughly along this line. Now let's play it through and carefully observe where exactly the attack took place here. The attack took place right here at Novobohdanivka. Novobohdanivka, that's the correct and official name of the location, as you can see. And we can see the distance up there. That's 38 kilometers. And if we look at it from the next realistic frontline position of the Ukrainian forces, it's roughly about 40 to 45 kilometers, which these small drones have covered to attack the train. And that's something, as I mentioned, the Russians never anticipated at all. Neither did we expect it, to be honest. So far, we had the farthest attacks using quadcopters around the Tokmak area. We saw some at the northern edge of the city, where you could say that was about 22 kilometers from the front. That was already a considerable distance. Now we're seeing that the Ukrainians can strike as far as 40 to 45 kilometers, targeting these rail connections that run through the area, and as a result, attacking the Russian trains operating there. Yet, not only in the occupied south of Ukraine are Ukrainian short-range drones being deployed for long distances and extended ranges, but also in the western regions of Russia. And here we have new footage that clearly demonstrates how absolutely crucial it remains for Ukraine to maintain its active presence in Kursk, within the Kursk region itself. Because as long as you're at the border, and as long as you give the Russians the sense that they remain threatened here, the Russians will also continue to deploy hardware to this area. At the beginning, we have an MTLB being attacked twice in a row by 2 different drones. It's not entirely clear where it's located. Here, Russian soldiers are also being hit. We're about to witness attacks on a Buk M1 system valued at around 12 million euros. Here we see them. And these attacks were geolocated. That means in this case, experts on the social network X managed to pinpoint exactly where this forest clearing is, where this Buk M1 system is located. And they have, as we'll now look at on the map, determined that it's situated roughly 35 kilometers from the border, specifically in the region of Kursk. Once again, we can see that the radar system is the primary target of the drone, because that's what remains critical even if the vehicle doesn't explode, even if it isn't destroyed. It is still most vulnerable to drone strikes. Now we're seeing the first impact of the initial drone once more, this time from a different angle. A Ural truck is behind it, and now we're also seeing it from the perspective of the second drone. Some traces are clearly visible here, most likely from the first impact. It's gotten darker now, probably evening time, the sun is slowly setting, and now the second impact. And based on these recordings, we see them here once more, experts have been able to determine where exactly it is. And we can say with relative certainty, we are near the city of Rilsk in the Kursk region. And indeed here we see once again that the recordings, so to speak, help with the localization. We've had more attacks, but this one we just saw on the Buk M1 system, that's the critical one to truly understand how far the Ukrainians can strike by now. Not with fixed-wing aircraft, not with any long-range drones or Shahed or the like which the Russians use, but rather with completely normal small quadcopters. Here we see Rilsk. The attack occurred here on the outskirts of the city, and we can essentially observe the distance from this point. The distance, even shooting from the border, would be around 35, possibly 40 kilometers, which lies just beyond the Ukrainian position. And here we also see a whole lot of other villages, and it's quite evident because Ukraine still continues to hold some small, very small parts of Kursk's territory. That's in this area because the Russians are advancing towards Sumy and have already taken control of the first 5 villages there. That's why it's still essentially an active war zone. Kursk is also an active war zone, and that's why the Ukrainians are managing, so to speak, to keep the Russians engaged here, pulling them further into this region. And consequently, they're also using their drones to carry out attacks within Russia.